He didn't even flinch when I said it. That's what I keep coming back to. I said, "Honey, why did your face go pale when I said the cameras were fixed?" And I watched the color drain out of him in real time, like someone had pulled a plug somewhere deep inside his chest. His jaw tightened. His eyes went somewhere I couldn't follow. And then, without a single word, he walked straight to the bathroom, clicked the lock, and turned on the water. I stood in our kitchen in the middle of that suffocating July heat, barefoot on the linoleum, and I listened. I heard him whispering. I couldn't make out every word at first, but I heard enough. 3 words came through clear as anything. She doesn't know. That was the moment I understood that 6 years of my life had been built on something I'd never actually been allowed to see. But let me back up, because none of this makes any sense without the beginning. I'm Nadine. I'm 52 years old, and I've spent the last 14 years selling furniture at a mid-size home goods store in Cloverfield, Ohio, a town so small that the biggest event of the year is the 4th of July parade down Maple Street, and everyone knows everyone else's business except apparently mine. I know the difference between a sectional and a chaise lounge better than I know my own reflection some mornings. I can tell you thread counts and wood finishes and the exact shade of taupe that makes a living room feel cozy but not closed in. I'm good at my job. I've always been good at my job. It was the one thing I never questioned. I met Warren 6 years ago in the spring. He came into the store looking for a dining room table. He was 51, recently relocated from Columbus, and he had this way of looking at you when you talked, like you were the only person in the room, like what you were saying genuinely mattered. I'm not naive. I know that charm is a skill some people develop for reasons that have nothing to do with sincerity, but at 46, after a decade of being on my own, I wasn't exactly in the habit of second-guessing warmth when I found it. We dated for about 8 months before he proposed. It wasn't a grand gesture, no restaurant, no crowd. He did it in my kitchen on a Tuesday night while we were doing dishes together, and my old dachshund, Pepper, was snoring under the table like she always did. Warren dried his hands on a dish towel, pulled a ring out of his shirt pocket, and said, "I don't want to do dishes with anyone else." I laughed so hard I cried. Pepper didn't even wake up. We got married in January, small ceremony, just close friends and his side of the family, because my family is scattered and complicated, and I didn't want the fuss. Warren's mother, Darlene, sat in the front row in a cream-colored blazer that she'd clearly chosen to compete with the bride. She kissed me on the cheek afterward and said, "You're exactly what I expected." I didn't know what that meant at the time. I filed it away and kept smiling. Life in Cloverfield settled into a rhythm that I genuinely loved. Our house was a 2-bedroom Cape Cod on Birchwood Drive, with a front porch that Warren repainted every other summer, and a backyard that never quite cooperated with my attempts at a garden. Pepper had her spot on the couch, a velvet cushion we'd specifically bought for her arthritic old bones, and she'd lie there in the afternoons while I prepped for the next day's shift, her gray muzzle twitching at dreams I'll never understand. Warren worked in property management. He handled a small portfolio of rental properties in the county, nothing glamorous but steady. He talked about numbers sometimes at dinner, occupancy rates and maintenance costs, and I'd half listen while refilling his coffee because I trusted him completely. That's the thing about trust. It doesn't announce itself. It's just the water you swim in, and you don't notice it until someone drains the pool. Darlene visited 4 times a year like clockwork. She lived 40 minutes away in a town called Harwick, in a house that Warren had co-signed on years before we met. She called it our family home, which I found odd but didn't push on. She was the kind of woman who straightened picture frames in other people's houses and offered opinions on your grocery choices without being asked. Warren's father had passed before I came into the picture, and Darlene had leaned into widowhood with the intensity of someone who'd found their calling. Warren was her project, her anchor, and, I would eventually understand, her property. She never liked me. She was too well-mannered to say it outright, but it lived in the little things. The way she called me Warren's wife at family functions instead of by my name. The way she'd referred to decisions Warren and I had made together, repainting the kitchen, refinancing the mortgage, as what Nadine wanted. as if he were a passenger in his own life, and I was the one driving him somewhere he hadn't chosen. For most of our marriage, I wrote it off as mother-in-law dynamics. Every woman I knew had some version of this story. You learn to manage it. You learn to smile at Thanksgiving and refill the wine and change the subject. But the cameras, that's where everything shifted. It started in June, actually, a month before the moment in the kitchen that I opened with. Our neighborhood had been dealing with a string of minor thefts. Someone had taken a bike off the Hendersons' porch 2 streets over. A package went missing from the Garcias' front steps. Nothing violent, nothing dramatic, but enough that the Cloverfield HOA sent out one of their breathless newsletters urging residents to invest in security systems. Warren and I talked about it over dinner one evening. "I've been thinking," I said. "We should put cameras up, front porch and maybe the backyard gate." Warren was quiet for a second longer than normal. Then he said, "Sure, whatever you think." That phrasing, "whatever you think." He usually had opinions. He usually had suggestions. I noticed it, set it down, moved on. We ordered the system online. A basic 4-camera setup, nothing fancy. It arrived in 2 weeks, and our neighbor Dale, who does handyman work on weekends, offered to install it for us. Dale's a good man, retired electrician, knows his way around wiring. He came over on a Saturday morning in late June, and I made coffee, and we chatted on the porch while he worked. Warren was out. He said he had to stop by one of his properties to deal with a water heater issue. He kissed me on the forehead and left around 9, and he wasn't back until nearly 2. I didn't think much of it. The cameras went up. Dale walked me through the app on my phone, showed me how to pull up the live feeds and review the recorded footage. It all seemed to be working. But a few days later, I noticed one of the cameras, the one angled toward the backyard, had gone dark. Just a black screen. I assumed it was a connectivity issue, a glitch, something mundane. I called Dale and he said he'd swing by when he had a chance. He came over on a Wednesday evening, poked around for about 20 minutes, and came back inside shaking his head. "Nadine," he said, "that camera wasn't disconnected by any glitch. Someone went in there and physically disabled it, pulled the wire loose from the mount, tucked it back so it wasn't obvious." I stared at him. "You're sure?" I asked. "Positive," he said. "I'll fix it up right now, but you should know, this was deliberate." He fixed it. He left. And I spent the rest of that evening sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of iced tea going warm in my hand, trying to figure out who would want one of our cameras disabled, and more importantly, when. Warren had been out the day Dale installed them. Warren had come home while Dale was still packing up his tools. Warren had walked the perimeter of the house that afternoon, which he said was just to check the angles, and I had thought nothing of it. I turned it over and over in my mind through that whole humid, sleepless night. July in Cloverfield is the kind of heat that makes your sheets feel damp by midnight, and Pepper kept shifting at the foot of the bed, her little nails clicking against the mattress frame. Warren slept beside me with the deep, even breathing of someone who had nothing on their conscience, or someone who was very, very practiced at pretending. The next morning, I called Dale back and asked him to come over one more time when Warren wasn't home. I asked him to double-check every camera, make sure they were all solid, make sure nothing else had been touched. Dale came by Thursday afternoon. He went through all 4 cameras methodically, tightened every connection, tested every feed. When he was done, he stood on my porch and said, "They're all good now. Every one of them is working exactly like it should." I thanked him. I made a note of it. I waited. Warren came home that evening around 6:30. I was in the kitchen putting together a salad, and the words came out of my mouth almost before I'd decided to say them. Casual, conversational, like I was talking about the weather. "Oh, by the way," I said, "Dale came by today. He fixed that camera issue, said they're all working perfectly now, every single one of them." And that's when I saw it. The color left his face. Not gradually, suddenly, like a light switching off. His hand, which had been reaching for the cabinet to get a glass, stopped mid-air. His eyes went to the window, then to the floor, then nowhere specifically, the way eyes go when a person is calculating something very fast and trying not to show it. "That's good," he said. His voice was flat in a way I'd never heard before. "You okay?" I asked. "Fine," he said. "Just tired." He put the glass back without filling it. He said he needed to use the bathroom. He walked down the hall and I heard the lock click, and then I heard the water come on. Too fast, too loud for someone who just needed a minute. I set down the salad tongs. I walked to the hallway. I stood outside that door and I held my breath and I listened. His voice was low and tight and careful, the way a person speaks when they're terrified of being overheard. I pressed my ear closer to the door. "She doesn't know," he was saying. "Not yet. But the cameras are fixed, and I need you to stop. I need everything to stop. Right now. Tonight." A pause. "Mom," he said, "just listen to me." The salad tongs were still in my hand. I don't remember picking them back up. I stood in that hallway with the July heat pressing in through every window, and I felt the floor tilt under me in a way that had nothing to do with the house. "Mom." He wasn't talking to a girlfriend. He wasn't talking to a business partner or a contractor or someone from one of his rental properties. He was talking to Darlene. And whatever they needed to stop, whatever they'd been doing that the cameras might have caught, it had been going on long enough that stopping it required a phone call the moment he thought he might be seen. I walked back to the kitchen. I set the tongs on the counter. I looked out the window at the backyard, at the small black camera mounted above the gate, its little red light blinking steady and patient in the fading light. I didn't say anything when Warren came out of the bathroom 6 minutes later. I handed him his plate. I sat across from him at the table where we'd eaten 1,000 meals together. I smiled when he smiled, and I started thinking about what, exactly, that camera might have already recorded. That night I didn't sleep. I lay on my side of the bed and watched the ceiling and listened to Warren breathe, and I thought about every single time Darlene had come to visit, every time she'd walked through our house with that particular kind of ownership in her posture, opening cabinets, touching things, commenting on the arrangement of furniture the way you do when you consider a space to be yours by some right that predates whoever happens to be living in it currently. I thought about the backyard. I thought about what the camera faced, the gate that opened onto the alley behind Birchwood Drive, the old storage shed that Warren had built 2 summers ago, the one he'd said was for lawn equipment and seasonal things, the one I'd never had much reason to look inside because Warren always handled the yard. I thought about why a person would need one specific camera to be blind. By 4 in the morning, I had stopped pretending to sleep. I got up quietly, padded down to the kitchen in the dark, and sat at the table with my phone. I opened the camera app. 3 feeds came up immediately: the front porch, the driveway, the side gate. The 4th, the backyard camera that Dale had repaired, was live and steady, the little red light pulsing in the corner of the frame. I scrolled back through the recorded footage. There wasn't much. The camera had only been working again for about 18 hours at that point, but I went through every minute of it anyway, watching the backyard in fast forward. Nothing. Just the yard, the shed, the gate, the motion of tree branches in the heat. No people. Of course there wasn't. Warren had called Darlene the moment he knew the cameras were functional. He'd told her to stop. Whatever it was, they'd paused it. Maybe for good. Maybe just long enough to figure out a new plan. I put the phone face down on the table and pressed my palms flat against the wood and breathed. The thing that was breaking me wasn't the not knowing. It was the realizing how long I'd not known. 6 years. 6 years of meals and grocery runs and mortgage payments, and Pepper sleeping on her velvet cushion, and Warren saying, "Whatever you think," and me swimming through that warm, unquestioned water of trust. 6 years during which something had been happening in my own backyard, and I had been the last person in Cloverfield to understand it. I picked the phone back up. I went to my contacts. I scrolled past Warren, past Dale, past the number for the store. I stopped at a name I hadn't called in almost 2 years, my sister Renata. Renata is 4 years older than me. She lives in Cincinnati, works in HR for a logistics company, and has the particular unsentimental intelligence of someone who has spent 20 years watching people lie to each other in professional settings. We drifted, not badly, not over anything dramatic, just the slow drift that happens when two women get busy with their separate lives and let months slide into longer months without meaning to. The last time I'd called her was when Pepper had a bad health scare the winter before, and even then it had been brief. I stared at her name for a long time. Then I put the phone back down. I wasn't ready to say any of it out loud. Saying it out loud would make it real in a way I couldn't take back, and I was still holding on to some small, stubborn part of me that wanted there to be an explanation I hadn't thought of yet. Something innocent. Something that would make the color coming back into Warren's face mean something other than what it looked like. But that stubborn part of me got a little smaller every hour. The next 3 days were the worst I have ever lived through quietly. That qualifier matters, quietly. Because I kept going. I went to work. I helped a young couple pick out a sectional for their new apartment and talked to them about clearance and delivery windows and how much weight the cushions could handle, and I smiled the whole time. And when I got to my car in the parking lot afterward, I sat there for 10 minutes without turning the key. Just sat. The kind of sitting where you're not thinking anything specific, just feeling the weight of everything pressing down from the inside. Warren was attentive those 3 days, solicitous even. He made dinner twice, which he rarely did. He asked about my day with what seemed like genuine interest. He touched my shoulder when he walked past me in the kitchen, a small habitual gesture that I'd always found comforting and now felt like a hand on a door, holding it shut. I let him. I smiled. I answered his questions. I was performing normal with everything I had, and I was good at it, because apparently we had both been performing for years, and neither of us had ever said so. On the 4th day, I came home from work, and Warren's car wasn't in the driveway. He'd texted to say he had to deal with a lease renewal on one of his properties and would be home by 7. I had 3 hours. I went to the backyard shed. The padlock was new. I hadn't noticed that before, or maybe I'd noticed and filed it away without understanding the significance. It was a heavy combination lock, the kind you'd put on a storage unit, not a garden shed. Warren kept his kayak paddle in there, his lawn aerator, a bag of grass seed. I stood in front of that shed in the July heat, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not sadness, not fear. Something harder, something with edges. I didn't have the combination. But I had a phone, and I had a brain, and I had been watching Warren for 6 years, which meant I knew things about him that he probably didn't realize I knew. I knew he used the same 4-digit code for his work voicemail that he used for his gym locker. I knew he was sentimental about his father's birthday, March 6th. I knew he recycled numbers the way anxious people recycle phrases. I tried 0306. The lock clicked open. I stood there for a moment with the open lock in my hand, just breathing. Then I pulled the shed door open. The kayak paddle was there. The lawn aerator was there. The bag of grass seed was there. And pushed against the back wall, behind the aerator, were 3 cardboard banker's boxes with lids on them, the kind you use to store files. I opened the first one. It took me 20 minutes to understand what I was looking at, and another 20 to stop shaking enough to take photographs of everything with my phone. Then I put every single piece of paper back exactly where I'd found it, replaced the boxes against the wall, closed the shed door, and snapped the combination lock shut. I went inside. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink for no reason except that I needed something to do with my body. I watched the water run over my knuckles. What was in those boxes was documentation. Leases, bank statements, transfer records, what appeared to be property deeds. The property management portfolio that Warren handled wasn't small. I'd always understood it to be modest, a handful of rental units in the county, enough to provide a steady supplemental income. But the papers in those boxes described something considerably larger. Properties I'd never heard him mention, accounts I didn't recognize, and Darlene's name on document after document as co-owner, co-signatory, beneficiary. Some of those documents had my name on them too, or something close to my name, Nadine Voss, which is my married name, on deeds that I had never signed. Signatures that were not mine. I stood at the kitchen sink until I heard Warren's car pull into the driveway. Then I dried my hands, picked up my phone, and went to sit on the couch. Warren came in, kissed me on the top of my head, said something about the lease renewal taking longer than expected. I said that was fine. I asked if he wanted leftover pasta. He said sure, that sounded great. We ate. We watched 40 minutes of a nature documentary about deep-sea fish that survive in total darkness by generating their own light. Warren fell asleep on the couch before it ended. I sat next to him and watched the screen and thought about my sister's number in my phone. The next morning, when Warren left for a property visit, I called Renata. She picked up on the second ring. "Nadine," she said, and the way she said it, just my name, nothing else, with that particular tone that means I've been waiting, nearly undid me completely. "I need to talk to someone," I said. "I need someone who isn't going to tell me I'm overreacting." "Tell me," she said. So I did. I told her about the cameras. I told her about the phone call through the bathroom door. I told her about the shed and the boxes and the documents with the signature that wasn't mine. I talked for almost 40 minutes without stopping, and Renata didn't interrupt once, which is not like her at all, and that restraint cost her something, I could tell. When I finished, there was a brief silence. "Nadine," she said, "those signatures, you're saying someone signed your name to property documents?" "Yes." "That's not a marital dispute," she said. "That's fraud." The word landed in my kitchen like something dropped from a height. "I know," I said. "You need an attorney, not a mediator, not a counselor, a real estate attorney or a family law attorney, ideally someone who handles both. And you need to stop touching anything in that shed, and you need copies of every photograph you took." "I already have them," I said. "I sent them to my email from the phone." Renata made a sound, not quite a laugh, something more complicated than that. "Good," she said. "Good girl." She helped me find a name that afternoon, a woman named Patricia Odom, an attorney in Dayton who handled family law and real estate disputes and had reviews online that used words like relentless and thorough. Renata called her office herself, from Cincinnati, because she said I sounded like I might lose my nerve if I had to make the call alone, which was accurate. The appointment was set for the following Tuesday. I had 5 days to keep being Warren's wife. 5 days of pasta and nature documentaries and his hand on my shoulder in the kitchen. 5 days of watching that little red light blink steady and patient above the backyard gate, recording everything, waiting. I was done being the person who didn't know. What I hadn't yet figured out was exactly how much I was about to find out, and whether the woman I'd been for the past 6 years would survive the knowing. But Tuesday was coming, and Patricia Odom, according to her reviews, did not lose. Patricia Odom's office was on the 4th floor of a brick building just off 3rd Street in Dayton, and it smelled like old carpet and strong coffee, and the particular kind of seriousness that accumulates in places where people come to fight for things that matter. Her assistant showed me in at 2 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon. Renata had driven up from Cincinnati that morning and was sitting in the waiting area with her coat folded over her lap, because that's who Renata is, she shows up. Patricia was in her early 60s with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. She shook my hand with the grip of someone who had stopped being gentle about difficult things a long time ago and hadn't missed the softness once. "Walk me through it," she said. "From the beginning. Don't leave anything out because you think it's too small." So I walked her through it. The cameras, the bathroom, his voice through the door, the 3 words, "She doesn't know." And then, Mom. I showed her the photographs I'd taken of the documents in the shed, 57 images, clear enough to read the text, clear enough to see the signatures. Patricia went through them on her laptop without saying anything for a long time. She enlarged several images, cross-referenced dates, made notes on a yellow legal pad. When she finally looked up, her expression was neutral in the practiced way of someone who has learned that showing outrage in front of a client only makes the client feel like the situation is more hopeless than it actually is. "Ms. Voss," she said, Someone has been using your name and signature to execute real estate transactions. I'm counting at least 4 properties on these documents where your signature appears as co-owner or co-signatory. Have you ever knowingly signed any document related to these properties? No, I said, not one. And your husband manages a rental property portfolio as his primary income. Supplemental income, or that's what I believed. Based on what I'm seeing here, Patricia said, setting down her glasses, it's substantially more than supplemental. I'll need originals or certified copies to proceed, but from these photographs, we're looking at potential real estate fraud, forgery, and possibly wire fraud depending on how the transactions were structured. This isn't just a marital asset dispute. This is criminal territory. That word again, criminal. Renata had said fraud on the phone, and it had landed hard, but criminal landed differently. Criminal meant something else entirely about the man who'd pulled a ring from his shirt pocket on a Tuesday night, while Pepper snored under the table. "What do I do?" I asked. "You go home," Patricia said. "You act as normal as you possibly can. You don't access that shed again. You've already documented what you need, and we don't want him knowing you have it. I'm going to contact a colleague in the county prosecutor's office. We're also going to file for divorce simultaneously so that we can freeze marital assets before anything gets moved or liquidated. I want to do this quickly, Ms. Voss. People in these situations tend to run when they feel the walls closing in." I thought about Warren standing in the kitchen with his hand frozen in the air, the color leaving his face. I thought about how he'd called Darlene the second he thought the cameras were live. "He already feels them," I said. "He's been careful since he found out the cameras were fixed." Patricia nodded. "Then we moved this week. We moved that week. What happened next had a speed and a coldness to it that I hadn't anticipated. I'd expected something more gradual, the slow machinery of legal process that grinds on for months. But Patricia was not a gradual woman, and the case she'd put together from my photographs, combined with the property records she pulled herself from the county recorder's office, was apparently compelling enough to move things quickly. By Thursday, she had spoken to the county prosecutor's office. By Friday, there was a warrant. I was at work on Friday afternoon when Patricia called me. "It's happening today," she said. "Go somewhere that isn't your house. Take your car, your phone, your ID, your insurance documents if you have them accessible, and go to your sister's or a hotel or anywhere that isn't Birchwood Drive. Officers will be executing a search warrant at your home this afternoon." I stood in the middle of the furniture showroom with a throw pillow in my hands and said, "Okay." "Nadine," Patricia said, "you did the right thing." I set the pillow down. I told my manager, Gail, that I had a family emergency. Gail has known me for 11 years, and she looked at my face and said, "Go, don't worry about anything here." I drove to the Hampton Inn on Route 40 and checked in with my credit card and sat on the edge of the bed in room 214 and called Renata. She answered before the first ring finished. "They're executing the warrant today," I said. "I'm getting in my car right now," she said. She was there by 6:30. We ordered room service, mediocre pasta that neither of us really ate, and we sat in the room and waited for Patricia to call. The call came at 8:15. "The search went as expected," Patricia said. "The documents in the shed are now in evidence. Mr. Voss was home at the time of the search. He's been taken in for questioning." "And Darlene?" I asked. A brief pause. "Officers spoke with her at her home in Harwick earlier this afternoon. She's retained a lawyer." Of course she had. Darlene had spent 30 years managing things from a careful distance, and she wasn't going to stop now. But the careful distance had collapsed. There was no managing the county prosecutor's office. I didn't sleep that night, but it was a different kind of not sleeping than before. Before, it had been the not sleeping of someone lying next to a stranger and trying to understand how she'd gotten there. This was the not sleeping of someone who had finally stopped pretending she was still in the dark. What came out over the following weeks, through Patricia, through the prosecutor's office, through documents that entered the public record, was this. Warren and Darlene had been running a scheme for years, long before I came into the picture. Darlene had inherited a small amount of money after Warren's father died, and Warren had used it as seed capital to acquire rental properties that they kept off the books by cycling the income through shell accounts. When Warren and I married, my name and my credit, which was considerably better than his, became useful. Darlene had found a notary willing to process documents without verifying identity in person. That notary, as I learned later through the court proceedings, had already been under investigation for a separate matter, which is how the prosecutor's office was able to move as fast as they did. The portfolio was not small: 14 properties in 3 counties. The combined value, as assessed during the investigation, was just over $1.4 million. My forged signature appeared on 7 of those deeds. 7. I sat with that number for a long time. 7 times someone had written my name on a legal document, handed it to a compliant notary, and walked away. 7 times Warren had come home and made dinner or watched television or put his hand on my shoulder in the kitchen, knowing what he'd done. 7 times Darlene had visited and straightened picture frames in my house and called me Warren's wife. Warren was charged with forgery, real estate fraud, and identity theft. The notary was charged separately. Darlene was charged as a co-conspirator. The case moved through the system over the next several months with the grinding, unsentimental efficiency of the legal process, when it has good evidence and motivated attorneys. Our divorce was finalized 7 months after I walked out of Patricia Odom's office for the first time. The marital estate, which turned out to be considerably more complicated than a Cape Cod on Birchwood Drive, was divided with the kind of precision that happens when one party has committed fraud and the other party has a relentless attorney. I was awarded the house, my own retirement accounts, and a settlement that accounted for the use of my credit and identity in the scheme. Patricia got me compensation under Ohio's identity theft statutes as well. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than I had started with, and it was mine in a way that nothing in those 7 years of marriage had actually been. Warren pled guilty to 2 counts of forgery and 1 count of identity theft. He was sentenced to 18 months, with eligibility for parole after 12. Darlene received 3 years of probation and a fine that her own attorney apparently spent considerable effort negotiating down. She did not, as far as I know, straighten a single picture frame in anyone's house during the proceedings. She kept her head down and her mouth shut, which might have been the most honest thing I'd ever seen her do. I went back to Birchwood Drive in September. The house was mine. I stood on the front porch that Warren had repainted every other summer and looked at the yard and the gate and the storage shed with its combination lock, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not relief, exactly, and not grief. Something quieter than both. Something that felt, after a long time, like solid ground. Dale came over that weekend and helped me take the shed down. We worked for most of a Saturday morning, pulling it apart piece by piece, stacking the lumber in the alley for whoever wanted it. When the concrete pad underneath was bare, I stood on it in the September sunlight and thought that I might put a raised garden bed there. My attempts at gardening had never cooperated with that backyard, but I'd been attempting the wrong thing in the wrong soil with the wrong person. I thought I might try again. Renata came for Thanksgiving. We cooked too much food and ate it at the kitchen table and talked until nearly midnight, which is what we should have been doing for the last 2 years, instead of letting the months slide. I kept the cameras, all 4 of them. The little red light above the backyard gate still blinks steady and patient in the dark, recording everything, missing nothing. Gail, at the store, asked me once if it felt strange to have them now, given everything. I thought about it for a moment. No, I said. It feels like paying attention. I should have been doing it the whole time. Pepper passed away the winter after all of this, in January, in her spot on the velvet cushion. She was 14 years old, and she went quietly, in her sleep, the way good dogs do when they've lived a full life in a house where they were loved. I cried harder than I had cried at any point during the investigation, the divorce, or the trial. I think that's because with everything else, I'd been holding myself together for a purpose. With Pepper, I finally didn't have to hold anything. I still work at the furniture store. I still know the difference between a sectional and a chaise lounge. I still know thread counts and wood finishes, and the exact shade of taupe that makes a living room feel cozy but not closed in. I'm 53 now, and some mornings I look at my reflection and I recognize the woman looking back in a way that I couldn't always say, even when I thought everything was fine. Patricia Odom sent me a card after the divorce was finalized. It said, "You paid attention when it mattered most. That's what won this." I put it on the refrigerator. It's still there. What I know now, that I didn't know a year ago, is that trust isn't the water you swim in without noticing. That's not trust. That's assumption. Real trust is something you build with eyes open, something you can look at clearly and still choose. Warren and Darlene had counted on me choosing to look away. They'd built their entire operation on the assumption that a woman who loved her life wouldn't examine it too closely. They were wrong about that, but only by one camera.